We'll move to the next speech. We have Erik with us. Erik is an associate professor at KTH and the head of the division of transport planning. He's going to talk to us about the impacts of COVID-19 on the public transit use in Sweden. Erik, excited to have you here and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. I'm going to share my screen here as well. All right, can you see that?
I can see it.
Great.
Looks good in the auditorium as well, so yes. Stage is yours.
It's perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will focus in a little bit on one particular country and in particular mostly on Stockholm and look at the impacts on public transport of COVID-19. You may have seen that Sweden has a little bit stuck out internationally in terms of the strategy to combat COVID-19. We haven't had a strict lockdown at any time, but rather the strategy has been more of a strong recommendations, let's say, from the government level about how to act as a citizen. So it can be interesting from that perspective also to take a bit closer look at Sweden in particular. So I will look on this from the perspective of what we can find from ticket validation or automatic fare collection data that we heard about previously today. And I will talk a little bit about what we can obtain for that information and what we cannot obtain. And specifically, I will explore a bit on how the travel with public transport has decreased with different modes of public transport in Stockholm, whether it is fewer people who travel each day or whether each person just travels less each day. What type of tickets that the travelers use and if that has changed throughout the COVID-19 period, and a little bit about different variations between different regions in Sweden. And then towards the second half, I will go a little bit deeper into the demographic distribution of these impacts. So who is still traveling and who has stopped traveling with public transport during COVID-19. And then I will wrap up a little bit towards the end. But first of all, it might be good to just take a look at the timeline of COVID-19 in Stockholm. It's probably quite similar in many parts of the world, but there are also a few differences in when the timing of different events occurred. But in Stockholm, things started happening a little bit during early March, but it was really sometime in the middle of March that things started happening rapidly. I've indicated some important events here, in particular for public transport. So there were recommendations to work from home, quickly also recommendations to only use public transport if strictly necessary. The public transport authority in Stockholm started restricting boarding buses through the front doors to avoid the risk of transmission to the drivers. This has strong implications for our data collection, which I will come back to. Universities closed during the spring, and there were restrictions on the size of public meetings and so on. Then things remained relatively stable during most of the latter half of the spring and the summer. Things have relaxed a little bit, and now during the fall we've had some partial opening of universities again, for example, which has an impact on the public transport use. So as I mentioned, we have looked primarily on the data from the fare collection system in Stockholm, which is basically covers all trips in the system. So tickets are validated when you enter a station or when you board a bus. On tram lines, there are also validations on the platforms or manually on board the vehicles. Normally, we have around 0.9 million travelers each day, which make on average 2 million trips per day. So from this data source, we have all the ticket validations, and we have for each card, we have a unique ID number, so we can monitor the activity of each card. But we don't know anything more than that of who is using the card. So we have no information about the demographic attributes of that person, for example. But on the other hand, this is a more or less complete data set compared to doing a survey on a sample, for example. But the fact that the validation takes place at the doors on the buses means that when that was restricted, boarding in the front gates, we lost this ticket validation data from the buses. So we could only look at the data from the metro and the commuter trains and the trams. But this is how it looks like if we break down the number of trips per day to the different modes, the metro and the commuter trains and the trams and light rail transit. We can see a sort of a moderate decrease in the beginning of March, but then we have this rapid decline in the middle of March, which I think is similar to how it has been in many parts of the world. And for the metro and the commuter trains, we had a drop of more than 60% of trips per day at the worst in the early April. Since then, we have had a slight return of ridership, but we are still seeing a drop of almost 50% compared to the corresponding period the previous year. The data for the trams show an even larger decrease, but that could be due to less active ticket validation, manual ticket validation, and more fare evasion during this period. So I think the data for the metro and the trains here are the most reliable. Then the next question then was, is this decrease due to fewer active travelers per day, or that each active traveler makes fewer trips? And if we split it like this, we can see that almost the whole decrease in ridership is due to that there are fewer active travelers in the system. Those who are still actively traveling with public transport, their average number of trips has decreased a little bit, but not much. I think that has a lot to do with the average number of trips is a little bit higher than 2 trips per day, and it is difficult to reduce it much more than that. Then it's also quite interesting to look at how different ticket product types has been affected, and this is a quite busy graph, but let's try to break it down a little bit. Starting from the bottom here, we have the short period cards. These are tickets valid for 24 hours up to 3 days. So these are tickets normally used by tourists. We see that these dropped to almost 0 during the spring. And then they have recovered a little bit, but still they are at a very low level compared to normal. And I think that is clearly related to that tourism has decreased drastically during COVID-19. Normally, the most popular type of ticket is the 30-year period card, which is the orange line here. That type of ticket has dropped quite drastically and has not really recovered very well since the spring. On the other hand, single trip tickets or travel funds, which are more flexible forms of tickets, have returned much more than the 30-day period cards. So this suggests that people are switching from these longer period cards to more flexible type of tickets now, probably because they might only go to work or school or university a couple of days per week, for example, which makes these type of tickets more attractive. We also see quite strong increases in the very long period cards and the school tickets. So I think that could indicate that those user groups are more captive to the public transport system. They might have fewer options than actually using public transport. Then we have looked a little bit into the regional differences within Sweden. So here we only have data until end of May for the regions of Västra Götaland and Skåne, which are the second and third largest population regions in Sweden. We can see some differences between the regions. So Stockholm seems to have been the region that was impacted the most, but overall, I would say the impact has been significant in all regions, despite that there was never really a strict lockdown of the society. But this was more due to citizens making their own decisions, as well as workplaces and so on making their more local lockdowns. So then as I mentioned, we have looked into a little bit deeper the demographic side of who is still traveling and who has stopped traveling with public transport. So we looked at all the trips early in the year before COVID-19 and identified 1.8 million active cards. And then for each of these cards, we identified the most likely home area of that card holder based on where the first ticket validation each day took place. And based on that, we linked each card with demographic data at this zone level. So we have a zone system here with demographic data where each zone contains around 1,500 inhabitants on average. So we have information about income, education, age, housing, employment, gender, and country of origin. So just to emphasize, we don't have this information at the individual card level, but only at the zone level. But then we studied for each card the activity during a few weeks during COVID-19 and try to correlate the travel activity during this period with these demographic attributes. So we estimated a statistical regression model where we try to explain whether a traveler has stopped traveling or not with these demographic attributes. And then we find that a person is less likely to stop travel if they travel much normally, and if they live in an area with relatively many women, many low-income workers, many residents born outside Sweden, or many families with children. On the other hand, a person is more likely to stop travel if they live in an area with many rental apartments, many unemployed, or many middle-aged, aged between 40 and 64. Then we analyzed it from also a little different perspective, sort of translating the demographics into geographics. So we clustered our zones in Stockholm based on these demographic attributes, and we could identify 5 fairly distinct clusters, which we sort of a little bit subjectively could attach labels to. So one type of zone we can call impoverished. These are zones with fairly low average income and education, and relatively high unemployment, and high share of children, families, and residents born outside Sweden. And then we have these 4 other types of areas: working class suburbs, rural areas, city areas, and garden suburb areas. So this is how it looks like if we just plot these clusters of areas on a map. We see quite clear geographical patterns here based on the demographic characteristics of the zones. And if we look at who is still traveling during COVID-19 using these clusters of areas as explanatory variables, we find that if we use a garden suburb type of area as a reference, the only group with a higher probability to stop traveling is the city areas, where we see a 16% higher probability to have stopped traveling. The so-called impoverished areas are those with the lowest probability to stop traveling, which is 22% lower than in the garden suburb areas. And then somewhere in between there, we have the rural and the working class suburb areas. So to conclude this still ongoing analysis, what we can see so far is that public transport travel has decreased drastically during COVID-19. We see currently a reduction of around 45–50% in Stockholm. But we had a minimum somewhere in early April. This reduction is mainly due to fewer active travelers rather than each person making fewer trips per day. And we see that these long period cards have been replaced by more flexible, shorter term tickets, single tickets and travel funds. We also see an increase in the very long period cards and the school tickets. And we see these quite clear patterns spatially and demographically in terms of who is traveling and who has stopped traveling. And we have these quite clear equity effects, really, of COVID-19. I think that an important factor here is that your level of income and things like that probably has a strong influence on your ability to work from home and maybe have other alternative ways of commuting and traveling, like a private car alternative or other options. Finally, just want to mention that if you are interested in learning more about the details, we have a couple of reports of this work coming out, and you can find the latest updates of our numbers on this website, where you can also find links to the reports. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a ton, Erik. Love the data, love the analysis, especially love the way how you correlated the different effects. I think we saw something similar when it comes to especially the single trip tickets, right? And the tourists not doing things. I've had many discussions with that on sort of if that's going to kill, well, not necessarily public transit, but if this has a strong effect on tourist heavy modes like micromobility and also in other areas. Same as before. Any questions from the audience here? Again, in the chat tool, I don't see any, but I'm sure we have some in the other tool.
Yes, there is one question here that says, Erik, are period cars refundable with a fee? Do you think many of the period passengers have just changed ticketing or have completely left PT?
As far as I know, the tickets are, I'm not sure exactly whether they are refundable with some charge or not. I think to be refundable without charge, you would have to return the ticket before your first use of it. I know that from my personal experience. I purchased a long period card just before COVID-19, but then I was actually able to return it before I used it. But I'm not sure exactly what the rules are if you have already started using it, whether you can return it with some refund. Then I'm sorry, what was the second part?
It says, do you think that many of the period passengers have just changed ticketing or have they completely left PT?
Yeah, I think the largest effect is probably that people have left PT, or at least don't use PT every day of the week as they did before. They might use it 1 day per week when going to work or something like that. I think this change of type of tickets is a strong effect, but on the overall, I think that's a smaller effect than the general decrease in public transport use.
Okay.
Very good. Any further questions from the audience, virtually, in person?
Yes, there's one more question we got saying, do you see a comeback for public transportation the coming winter while COVID is still around?
I think for Stockholm, my expectation is that I expect to see a large reduction in ridership compared to normally for the foreseeable future, as long as COVID-19 is around. Yeah, I would expect to see clear reductions in ridership for considerably longer period.
Okay, I see.
I see another one. I see one more in the chat function. It's where were their trips going during the COVID conditions in April, even though work and studies from home has been implemented?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We haven't been able to look into that much detail about where the trips went, and our data doesn't allow us really to say that much about the purpose of the trips. We can only see where the trips ended at the station or stop level. But I think even during this period in April, we still had a fairly large part of the population who still had to work, since many workplaces were not closed, and many who did not have the opportunity or possibility to work from home during this period. So I think many trips, even during this period, were still work trips.
Great. Any more questions? Erik, you had the most exciting presentation that triggered the most questions. Loving it.
Yep.
Anybody else?
Apparently no more questions from here.
Okay, well then, thank you everybody for the great questions.